7 o'clock every Monday night, 7 to 10, so it's a 3-hour radio show on this very stuff. On Woodstock 104.1. Am I right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. 104.1, commercial-free, progressive community radio, no commercials. So I just want to introduce...
Excuse me, that doesn't stream online, right?
It doesn't stream online. The station is all digital, it's all analog, no digital.
Yeah.
And at present, it's not streaming, it's not on internet. You can only listen to it on the radio or get DVDs from me whenever I make copies. But tonight we have we're honored to have a special guest who came from Sweden to the United States and did a tour on the West Coast. Now he's doing a tour on the East Coast. And are we the last show on the tour?
No, there's Boston and New York left. There's about 4 more events.
3 more events on the East Coast before he goes back to Sweden. His name is Chris Bollyn. He's written books, articles. He's prolific in his writing and in his presentations, and has been on the scene, the 9/11 scene, since the very beginning. He was an investigative journalist at the time, investigating this very kind of thing. So when it happened, he dove right into it. So without further ado, I want to present the man of the hour, Mr. Chris Bollyn. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. Can you hear all right? Can you see all right? Is it clear? Should we turn the lights down a little bit?
Just
the front
one.
lights, maybe, so you can see better?
Just one, Gary. Nope, not that one. There you go.
There you go.
How's that?
Yeah, that's
Better.
good.
Okay.
Good.
It's a pleasure to be here. Of course, Woodstock is an icon in American culture, and I would simply say in starting that Woodstock is famous for the anti-war concert that happened here in 1969, and today we've been at war for 25 years, something like that. If you count the beginning of the war in Iraq in January 1991, it's 25 years, isn't it? And yet there is really no significant anti-war movement in this country at all. And why is that? It's because the American nation is a deceived nation. We're in a state of deception. And that deception has been imposed on us mostly by our media. And my tour is called Solving 9/11 Ends the War. And what I mean by that is that when you understand the deception of 9/11, and when you understand the deception of the war on terror, the so-called war on terror that we've been involved in since 9/11, then you can understand that this whole thing rests on deception. That's why our nation has been kept in this deceived state, because as long as we're deceived, we are under their power. But as soon as you break out of the deception, as soon as the deception is exposed and revealed, it loses its power to control you. And that's why I call this Solving 9/11 Ends the War. And this photograph was taken in Hollywood, California, believe it or not. And that's at the Oscars last year. I had a one-man manifestation February 22nd of last year. Because it's, I'm trying to bring this message to the media moguls as well, because I suppose there are some good people out there in the media. Although, of course, we have a special problem today in that the media in this country is now in the hands, it's been consolidated to the point that the media is in the hands of 6 companies, 6 corporations control the overwhelming majority of the media in this country, which is a first in American history. Typically, we've always had a multitude of families and organizations that own the media. And it's been consolidated to the point where it's almost a monopoly. It's a monopoly opinion in any case. This is my book, Solving 9/11, The Deception Changed the World. This is the smaller book. This book presents my analysis in a concise and very regal format. The larger book, Solving 9/11, the original articles, contains all my articles that I wrote from September 2001 through to April 2012 when I published the book. My background was that I was an investigative journalist working in Washington, D.C. I was writing for a little weekly newspaper that called itself Populist, and it was called American Free Press. And I'd been working with that newspaper for about a year and 3 months when 9/11 happened. And I happened to be passing through New York City with my wife and children early in the morning on 9/11. I was returning from Stowe, Vermont. I was going down back to the office in Washington, and we got a late start. And so it just so happened that, we were passing right by the World Trade Center at about 2 o'clock in the morning on September 11th. And as we passed by, my wife was, to keep me awake, she told me about a dream she had when we left Chicago about a week earlier, in which we had been driving towards the city with this massive skyline, which only New York has. And as we approached the city, in her dream, the plane came at our car, and about 50 meters in front of the car, the plane went into the ground. And she turned around in her dream and saw the plane come out of the ground and swirl around, and then there were several planes attacking us. And this is just one of those uncanny things that, my wife is telling me this dream. It's in the beginning of my book. She's telling me this dream on September 11th, about 6 hours before it happened.
Wow.
So, I mean, this is one of the things. There's actually a whole study about these kinds of people that picked up the kind of cognition of the event through the ether. There's a lot of people that actually had dreams like that. For my wife, it was a very vivid dream. Well, I was an investigative journalist at the time, and I was based in Washington, D.C., but I wrote mostly from my home in Illinois. My background was that I have a history degree from the University of California, Santa Cruz, where I studied Israel and Palestine. That was my specialty. And I spent a lot of time in the Middle East and Israel. And I saw that this conflict, Israeli-Palestinian conflict, was sort of like a core conflict of the world. It's like a Gordian knot conflict. It's much more than a usual territorial kind of conflict. It's something much bigger than that. So I thought it was something that deserved to be, to put my attention to for a degree. And before all that, I grew up in Illinois, in Schaumburg, outside Chicago, where I was an Eagle Scout and altar boy and those kinds of things. So now, why does 9/11 truth matter? Here we are 14 and a half years later. Why is it so important that we understand what really happened on 9/11? Well, a very good comparison is, why does the murder of President Kennedy still matter 53 years later? It matters because the murder of President Kennedy was actually a coup d'etat. And the powers behind the assassination then took control of the government and orchestrated the cover-up. And the man raising his hand here played a big role in that cover-up, actually. A coup d'etat that is kept secret in a democratic nation means that the succeeding government is illegitimate. As you remember, the U.S. military involvement in Vietnam spanned a period of 20 years, from 55 to 75. But the real war began for the United States after the murder of Kennedy. Of course, that's when they spiked, LBJ sent more troops and upped the, surge. They put the surge on in Vietnam after Kennedy was killed. Kennedy, of course, wanted to withdraw the troops. He wanted the war to go away. The Kennedy assassination still matters because the U.S. government continues to support the lies of the Warren Commission, which, of course, says that Lee Harvey Oswald and Jack Ruby both acted on their own without any conspiracy. The Kennedy assassination still matters because the mainstream media continues to support that version and endorse the official Warren Commission report. The Kennedy assassination matters because when the government supports the lies about the murder of the president, it means that the powers that killed President Kennedy are still in charge to this very day. Of course, the American people have always considered that there was a conspiracy. The top green line, the light green line, indicates the percentage of Americans generally who believe that there were others involved, that there was in fact a conspiracy. The dark green line suggests the number of people, the percentage of people who believe the Warren Commission. And it has been before almost as high as 90% of American people believe it was a conspiracy. So likewise, why does 9/11 still matter? Here we are 14 years later, and a lot of people might say, oh, well, that happened then, and it's over. It was terrible, but we went to war and we cleaned up the area and we got rid of Osama bin Laden, so it's all done. Not so simple. Not so simple. It's quite more complicated than that, actually. This photograph, I just want to point out, this energetic explosion coming out of the South Tower here is actually coming out of the place where the plane went in. The plane went out the other side there where you see the burning kerosene behind the Marriott Hotel sign. Okay, so 9/11 matters because the government continues to lie about what happened to this very day. And of course the government has been these two administrations here. 9/11 matters because it was a policy coup that brought us the war on terror and a series of disastrous wars. And these wars are being waged in countries you don't even know about. Just the other day, about 3 or 4 days ago, the United States bombed in Somalia and killed 150 people who had just graduated, who were participating in their graduation ceremony from a military school. And they were like, lined up in chairs, and they're getting their degrees or they're getting their diplomas, and the United States drone bombed them and killed 150 of them. And this is in, of course, East Africa, Horn of Africa. And the only explanation at the bottom was that the media said that the government said that they had information that these people were planning to attack America. So we killed 150 of them. And this is going on in Yemen. This is going on in North Africa. This is going on in East Africa, in South Africa, in West Africa, in Yemen. It's everywhere. The war on terror is multifaceted, like it's everywhere. But we only hear very little about it. 9/11 Truth matters because for 14 years the mass media has pushed the 9/11 myth and the fraudulent war on terror, all the while suppressing the very real evidence and facts that disprove that myth. So, likewise, if the government and media are lying to us about 9/11, it means that they, the government and media, are controlled by the very same people who carried out 9/11. Now, that's a logical conclusion that's easily supported by logic, and that gives you an idea of how serious our political predicament is in this nation. We're living in a very, very serious situation now, with a government that is on the verge of waging more wars with even bigger players like Iran and Russia. So this is a very serious thing, as if the war in Syria wasn't bad enough. Well, as Richard Nixon said, it's not the crime that gets you, it's the cover-up. And that's because he knows, he should know, because in a cover-up, you have to leave your trail. A cover-up requires that people maintain the deception. They continue to suppress the evidence. They continue to support the lies. And you can see who they are. They have names, they have positions, they're paid by taxpayer dollars. So, as time goes on, the cover-up becomes more and more and more transparent and evident. And people that are involved in the cover-up are complicit in the crime itself. It's not like it's one hand doing this and one hand. They're connected. They're complicit in the same crime. So the three crucial elements of a false flag cover-up are, first, control the investigation and access to the evidence. Then control the interpretation of the event. That's how it's explained to the public. What narrative the public is given to explain what happened. And thirdly, control the litigation, the court process, to prevent any legal discovery from coming out in a court of law. You may remember that there were 3,000 families who lost somebody on 9/11, but all 3,000 families were settled out of court. There will never be a 9/11 trial for any of the wrongful death. That's amazing. So the first aspect I'm going to talk about is the controlled investigation of 9/11, or really, more to the point, the non-investigation. It's important to understand that 9/11, the crime of 9/11, the murder of 2,700 people in New York and other places, was never investigated as a crime. It was not investigated as a crime. Rather, the government basically said that they attacked the Pentagon. The Pentagon is our central fort. That makes it an act of war. Therefore, we are going to go to war against these 19 Arabs and where they came from and who sent them. That was the logic they used. So they said, let's clean up Wall Street, let's get back in business. Go shopping. Well, the people who were at the very top of the law enforcement in this country on 9/11, especially because it was a crime of terrorism, it went to the FBI and the Department of Justice. And the person who headed the Department of Justice at that time was Attorney General John Ashcroft, on the left, and his assistant Michael Chertoff, who happens to be an Israeli national, a dual national American-Israeli. And they put Chertoff in charge of the investigation of 9/11, the criminal investigation that, as I said, never happen. It never happened. And for day-to-day decisions regarding this investigation or the processing of the evidence, Chertoff had the last word. So Michael Chertoff was in charge. After Chertoff finished his time as Attorney General, Assistant Attorney General, Criminal Division, he then had a brief stint as a lawyer, as a judge, and then they made him Secretary of Homeland Security. So he was the second Homeland Security czar, they called it. And this is when he was sworn in 2005. Now, what's important to understand is that Michael Chertoff, in his first position at the Department of Justice, because he was in charge of the investigation, he controlled all access to the evidence. He controlled who investigated what questions were asked, what happened, everything. And then in this position as Homeland Security Czar, he then maintained his control over the evidence through a special clause in a special department that they set up in the Patriot Act. Another person who was very responsible for the cover-up and suppression of information coming out and problems rising, being stifled, was this Mayor Bloomberg. Mayor Bloomberg, of course, served 3 terms, unprecedented in New York history. They changed the law in order to allow him to have his 3rd term. And so he served 12 years after 9/11. And in that position, he basically suppressed information from coming out in New York. And very much it concerned the very sick first responders, the firefighters and the police, who were exposed to the extremely toxic smoke at the World Trade Center, of whom 1,600 have already died. And I want to point out, here he is in Israel. He's meeting with Ehud Barak, the defense minister, in 2008, 2009, when Israel launched an operation against the people of Gaza called Operation Cast Lead. And that happened at Christmas time, 2008, just as Bush was going out and Obama was coming in. And it was called Operation Cast Lead, but it was also cast a little bit of white phosphorus. And this is a photograph showing an Israeli phosphorus shell. This is white phosphorus. It's a banned weapon being dropped on the people of Gaza. And this is a hideous weapon. It's banned, of course, because the burning phosphorus will burn through a person's body, and there's nothing you can do about it. You can't put it out with fire, with water, or anything. It just burns right through you. So he went there to support this Israeli defense chief as he was casting white phosphorus on the people of Gaza. Well, Mayor Bloomberg was also very close to Bibi Netanyahu, the current Prime Minister of the State of Israel. And Bloomberg said some things that were very insensitive about the victims of 9/11. On the first anniversary of 9/11, he made phone calls to the widows, something like 400 widows. And some of these widows were first responder widows, firefighters, widows, and people like that. Some of these people were obviously so devastated that the women just cried. And he felt about these women that cried they should buckle up. And this is a quote that he said. It said, he's talking about the widows. He said, "It's not my business to say to that woman, suck it up and get going. But that's the way I feel." Would he say? I just would posit to you. Would he say the same thing about a Holocaust widow, for example? Would he be so insensitive? But he was very insensitive about these 9/11 victims, which is a very odd thing, actually, for the mayor of New York to say. Mayor Bloomberg, here he is with Netanyahu visiting the newly opened 9/11 memorial. And Mr. Netanyahu wanted to see the names of the 4 Israelis who died on 9/11. And this is from the video where Bloomberg is showing him around. Now we're going to talk about the constructing of the narrative and the people who controlled the interpretation of 9/11. That's what we understood of 9/11. Well, of course, most of us get our information from the media. We either read the newspaper, listen to the radio, watch TV, something like that. And as I said, the media in this country is now so consolidated that you have people like Mr. Murdoch here who own hundreds of newspapers in this country. There are towns in this country where he owns, or his company owns, the radio stations, the TV stations, and the newspapers. In fact, there is no other competing media outlet in several towns. And here he was, Mr. Murdoch, and he has been pushing the 9/11 myth, and his media has pushed the 9/11 myth and pushed the war on terror. And people like that are actually complicit in a criminal fraud. Because, promoting a war, conspiring or promoting a war of aggression, like what the United States committed in Iraq, is in fact a war crime. It's actually considered to be the mother of all war crimes. It's called a crime against the peace. And the United States wrote that law in Nuremberg, actually. And so these people, these media moguls who pushed the lies of 9/11 and pushed the war on terror are guilty. They're complicit. What's important to understand here is that these people like Murdoch do not pull themselves up by themselves. They are actually created by big, well-heeled financial people like the Rothschilds, banksters, I call them. And these banksters create moguls like Mr. Murdoch in order to control public opinion. They want to control public opinion in this country and in the English-speaking world. I want to point out here that these two men actually are joint owners in a company in the occupied Golan Heights in Syria, where they have a company with some other people to develop the gas and oil reserves of the Golan Heights. The Golan Heights, of course, still belongs to the government of Syria, right? Which is part of the reason why this war is going on, because these powers want to break Syria into pieces so that they can actually own that piece of the pie. And likewise, the Rothschilds own the largest oil company in Kurdistan, where American troops are now fighting in North Iraq, the northern Kurdish area. So they've been positioned in these places. The Rothschild ownership of the oil and gas of Kurdistan goes back to 2002. So right away they got in there and got that oil and gas contract. Here's the New York Times on the day after 9/11 with the government and media story intact. But Larry Johnson, who was a former director of counterterrorism at the United States State Department, he looked at the 9/11 crime and in its complexity, and he said, we don't have anything in history to compare with this. The only thing that comes close to it is a former Soviet intelligence operation. It's not so simple. It's not like they said that just these planes were hijacked and flown into the Twin Towers, and this all just kind of like happened with these 19 Arabs. That's the narrative that you've been given. That is far from the truth. The New York Times, though, however, took this position that they were not going to investigate the 9/11 crimes at all. They were not going to ask any questions about the narrative. They were simply going to, like the rest of the media in this country, they were going to support the government narrative, the official story, and that was it. No questions asked. Now, that's not the way a great newspaper should work in a democratic nation. A great paper like the New York Times has an obligation to conduct its own investigation to see if what the government tells us about 9/11 is true. And when evidence pops up, when evidence is made clear that there's problems with this narrative, it's their duty to talk about it, to discuss it, to present it to the public. None of that has happened. People like me, rather, have been ostracized by the media, condemned, slandered, smeared, and we're treated, so that 9/11 truth is kept in a closet. But this is what they said, the New York Times. This is 3 years after 9/11. This is the lead editorial. The New York Times, of course, is a family-owned paper, Sulzberger Ox family, one of the founding families of the B'nai B'rith in Lodge Number 1 in New York. And this is what the paper said on September 11, 2004. In the 3 years since 9/11, we've begun to understand that it's possible to know what happened without knowing what happened. Now, this is Alice in Wonderland logic.
Really?
This is Mad Hatter talk. But they could say such a thing, such a brazen statement of disregard for the truth. It's amazing. Then they said at the end, they say some of what we need to know publicly has been provided by the 9/11 Commission report. Other answers are lacking, and they leave it at that. Well, one of the answers that's certainly lacking is what happened to this building. This is the building number 7, WTC 7. This is owned by Larry Silverstein. It's formerly the Solomon Brothers building. Built in the mid-'80s. Larry Silverstein owned it outright. And at 5:25 in the afternoon, on 9/11, this building simply fell down into its own footprint and was a pile of rubble within its own foundation. This has not been explained. The U.S. government 9/11 Commission report did not even address this subject. They ignored it completely. This was not discussed in the 9/11 Commission report. So this is like something that happened that was not explained, and people like the New York Times had no interest in it. But it's the first time in history that a steel-framed building has fallen down into its footprint without anything happening to it other than having sporadic fires. This man is Philip Zelikow, and he is what we call the 9/11 myth maker, because he is the executive director of the 9/11 Commission, and he was the person who wrote the outline of the report that became the 9/11 Commission report. And his specialty, he studied at Rice University, and his thesis, when he got his doctorate, I believe it was on the creation and maintenance of the public myth. And it's the idea that the public, the American public, for example, the public needs to have a myth that they can understand. It doesn't have to be true, but they have to have this myth. And he provided it. So in March 2003, he completed the outline of the 9/11 Commission report before his staff even began writing it. And then he simply, he picked and chose what evidence they would use to bolster that report, that narrative. That's what he did. But his other job, previous and subsequent to that, was he was the counselor to Condoleezza Rice, Secretary of State. And here he is, Condoleezza Rice, and he's in the middle there with the glasses, meeting Ehud Olmert, the Prime Minister of Israel. Ehud Olmert just began serving a jail sentence in Israel for about a year for bribery. He was sentenced originally to 8 years, but they got it down to about 1 year in jail. He's the first Israeli Prime Minister to go to jail. It's interesting that he was actually in New York City on 9/11. But what Philip Zelikow said prior to the United States going to war with Iraq, the discussion was about the weapons of mass destruction that Iraq allegedly had. Whether they had them or not, that wasn't really the issue. But he said, I'll tell you what I think the real threat is, and has been since 1990. It's the threat against Israel. So Iraq did pose a serious threat to Israel, that's for sure. But it wasn't a threat to the United States or to Britain. Now, if you don't believe the official story of 9/11, which I suppose many of you don't, you're in pretty good company, because this most conservative estimate here is that about 60% of the American people do not believe the official report. But when the questions are a little bit more direct and specific, such as this question, when it comes to what they knew prior to 9/11 about possible terrorist attacks against the United States, do you think members of the Bush administration are telling the truth, or mostly telling the truth but hiding something, or are they mostly lying? Well, in 2002, 73% of the population thought they were mostly lying or hiding something. And that increased. That number increased in 2004, and it increased even further in 2006. So that 81% of the people thought that the administration was mostly lying or hiding something. And when they found that only 16% of the people thought that the Bush administration was telling the truth, they stopped polling. Because they were, the tendency was to greater skepticism. Well, that's with good reason, because you have people like the 9/11 commissioners themselves have come out after the commission work and stated that it's a pack of lies. It says 6 out of 10 of the 9/11 commission members have gone on record to admit there was a U.S. government cover-up. This man was the senior counsel, John Farmer. He was senior counsel to the commission. He wrote afterwards in a book, he said, what government and military officials told Congress, the commission, the media, and the public about who knew what when was almost entirely and inexplicably untrue. And the commissioners themselves, these are the co-chairmen. This is Thomas Keane and Lee Hamilton in the back. And Thomas Keane said, to this day, we don't know why NORAD told us what they told us. It was just so far from the truth. So on all these questions that the commission dealt with, they were given false information, and they produced a false report. And that false report is the official myth. Now, there were other documents produced. This is not to replace the criminal investigation. The criminal investigation never happened. The FBI allowed the evidence to be destroyed rather than to investigate it. But these people, they gave us some of these glossy kind of final reports or analysis. These are these engineering studies that were done by the FEMA, part of the U.S. federal government. And they put this man in charge of this. It's called the Building Performance Studies. This man is Gene Corley. He's from Skokie, Illinois. His whole career, his specialty is concrete. He's a concrete guy. But they put him in charge of this investigation where there was no concrete left at all. All that was left of the World Trade Center was dust and steel. At ground zero, all that was left was steel. And here he is in the pile of steel, making some critical measurements here, I'm sure. But I called him and I asked Mr. Corley, I said, are you testing the steel for evidence of explosives or explosions? And he said, I don't know anything about that. He said, I'm not a metallurgist. So the question is, why are you put in charge of this pile of steel? And the reason why he was put in charge of this pile of steel is that Gene Corley has done similar reports for the U.S. government before. Most notably, he did the Waco study about Waco, Texas, what happened down there when they killed the Branch Davidians. And then he went out and did the Oklahoma study about the bombing of the Murrah building in Oklahoma City. So his real specialty is crafting these kinds of glossy reports that tell you nothing except basically support the government story. He's passed away of cancer now recently. a couple years ago. This is a white paper, you know, like from the chapter, the cover of the book. It's the final report on the collapse of the World Trade Center towers. This is produced by an organization called NIST. It stands for the National Institute of Standards and Technology. It's a sub-agency of the Department of Commerce. And in 2005, when they wanted to wrap this report up and present it to Congress and the American people, this man was the director of NIST. His name is William Jeffrey, formerly Jaffe, and he was the director of NIST. This NIST study did not look for any evidence of explosives. Although eyewitnesses and all the evidence indicated that explosions were involved, their study did not look at any of that evidence. But what's interesting about this man is that he has a long history prior to coming on at NIST of being the chief scientist for the Tactical Technology Office for DARPA, which stands for Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. And he was involved in developing things like sensor development for the Predator and Global Hawk. So this man is a scientist at the highest level for the most advanced weaponry in the United States. And he was then taken in, put in charge of crafting this whitewash of the World Trade Center, which is kind of like akin to putting a fox in charge of the hen house. Well, here he is. Afterwards, he went on to become the CEO of an organization called SRI International. SRI stands for Stanford Research Institute. It's in Menlo Park, California, next to Stanford. And it is a nonprofit R&D, research and development organization that produces advanced weaponry for the United States government. And one of the most important things that they develop is they develop something called novel energetic materials. What we're talking about are materials that are crafted to produce great amounts of energy, explosives, actually. And this kind of thing is created with nanotechnology. So you take an explosive and you make it at a nanotechnology level and it becomes super powerful. And the lab where they make these kind of nanocomposite energetic explosives is headed by an Israeli. The man on the right, Mr. Bloom, who's been the director of that laboratory at SRI since 1984. The government's been developing these things for a long time, actually. And furthermore, this interpretation has been carved into granite, literally, at the memorial at Ground Zero. And the memorial, this is what I call the legacy. The 9/11 memorial was designed and built by an Israeli, a friend of the Netanyahu family, actually. His name is Michael Arad. He's the son of Moshe Arad, the former Israeli ambassador to the United States. And here's Michael Arad in front of the building, the memorial that he designed. So it's interesting to see that the role of these people, and that there's so many high-level Israelis involved in this entire operation. Now, the control of litigation is the control of the court process. As I said, there were 3,000 families affected by 9/11. The first 2,900 basically took the U.S. government compensation money and signed off and went home, took their grief home. There were, however, 96 families who held out for a process, for a court process, in which they would have some legal discovery and find out who was responsible for the crime of 9/11. Who was responsible, for example, for letting these hijackers on the plane? If they were on the plane, how did they get on the plane? And the company that was involved with letting them on the plane is an Israeli company called ICTS. This was the judge in Manhattan, Judge Alvin K. Hellerstein, who oversaw what they call the 9/11 tort litigation. These are the 96 families who were in a process, who wanted to know what happened, who dropped the ball, who was responsible for the loss of their loved one. The problem is that in the court process that this man was managing, the key defendant was this Israeli company from Holland, ICTS, that provides airport security, passenger screening operations in Boston, in Newark, all across the United States on 9/11. This company was excused. The judge at the end of the process said, I don't know why you're here. He said, you're just a parent company. You can go home. So on his own unilateral choice, he allowed this key defendant to go home, back to Israel, off the process. The problem is, though, is that his son is a lawyer in Israel representing that company. That's called a primary family conflict of interest. It's not kosher. And here's the situation. His son, Joseph, up the top there, moved to Israel, I think, in 2001 or 2000, and he's a lawyer for an Israeli company. He got the Israeli bar exam, all that. And he's a lawyer for this company, Kuckerman Company, which is a Rothschild company, and they owned the company called Huntley USA, which oversaw passenger screening operations on 9/11. So if those 19 Arabs got on the plane with box cutters and everything, they would have to go through this Israeli screening process, where this Israeli company was being held to account for what happened. But what happened is that the judge and his assistant, they fought a war of attrition against those 96 families. And one by one, every family was settled out of court. So, as I said, there will never be a 9/11 process. There will never be a trial for 9/11 because all the people who lost somebody have been settled out of court. And when they settle out of court, when they take the money, when they sign the dotted line, it's all over for them. They can never go back to court. This was managed by, in the first case, the 2,900 families who took the compensation money. This was doled out by the man at the top, Kenneth Feinberg, and he was responsible for processing those 2,900 families. People can't talk about how much they got. They can't talk about any of the terms of the contract. It's like a gag order is imposed on them once they take the money. And I want to point out that this man and his wife who worked together with him on this, they're very high level, what we call Zionists. They're very big supporters of the state of Israel. Like in the case of him, his wife is an executive member of the United Israel Appeal. It's a fundraising thing for Israel, and the Jewish Federation of Washington, and she is on the board of governors of the Jewish Agency. The Jewish Agency is the top Zionist apparatus organization in the world for the state of Israel. And the lady down below, Sheila Birnbaum, she was the special mediator who worked with the judge to take care of those remaining 96 families as they were settled out of court one by one. This man, Michael Mukasey, happens to go to the same synagogue, Orthodox synagogue, Zionist synagogue in New York with Judge Hellerstein. So every Saturday these guys meet in the synagogue. And Mukasey, he presided over the 1993 bombing at the World Trade Center, which was the first bombing at the World Trade Center, in which, if you read the New York Times, you'll know it was an FBI sting operation in which the FBI actually crafted the bomb and basically paid this Egyptian informant, colonel, $1 million to kind of like bring into his orbit these people who would be implicated for the crime. Like the blind sheikh, remember the blind sheikh, who's now serving like 5,000 years in jail. They didn't do it. They're simply the people who were grabbed and blamed for it.
And your lawyer.
Yeah, thank you. And it's interesting, in the case of the 1993 bombing, the chief prosecutor was none other than Michael Chertoff. And this man also, Judge Mukasey, also oversaw the battle between Larry Silverstein, who was the owner and the leaseholder of the two towers in Building 7, the three buildings that came down on 9/11. He had a battle with the insurance companies claiming double indemnity, double payment, saying it was two events. And this judge oversaw the process in which he was given double indemnity for both buildings. So he went from being a person who had put down, who had obtained this public property with $100 million down payment of borrowed money from GMAC to being the recipient of something like $7.5 billion. And now he's the owner, of course, of the World Trade Center #1. And that was all done in that courtroom. Now, we're going to talk about this fraudulent war on terror. This is the fraud of our time. Here we have these horrific pictures from Guantanamo, Cuba, where the United States, of course, has this gulag prison, the kind of thing we used to read about in the Soviet Union. The question is, if 9/11 is a deception, what is the war on terror? If 9/11 is a fraud, then a fraud begets a fraud. Then the war on terror is a fraud. The question is, where did this come from? The war on terror began, our active participation in this war began in October 2001, about 3 weeks after 9/11, but it's ongoing to the present day. If you pay attention to these figures, the United States still has like 10,000 troops in Afghanistan and Iraq, and we have a lot of contractors there. Nobody's counting them. And now they're talking about sending U.S. Army back into Iraq to protect the special forces that are operating in Kurdistan. So the war is ongoing, and that's not even talking about all these other places where the United States is fighting, like Mali and Somalia and Libya and Yemen and Syria. It's like endless. Well, what is the war on terror? As I point out in my book, and I document, the war on terror is basically a Zionist Israeli fraud based on lies and deception and exaggeration, as it has been since Bibi Netanyahu began pushing it in the late 1970s. The war on terror is essentially a Zionist war agenda to be fought by the United States and others. Now, when I say Zionist, it means, of course, Jewish nationalism, like the State of Israel, but it also it incorporates people who don't live anywhere near Israel, like Joe Biden and the Rothschild family, and people of that sort who are actively supporting the Zionist agenda, but don't live anywhere near Tel Aviv. Here's an interesting man involved in this. His name is Meir Dagan, the man on the left. He was born in the USSR. His name was Huberman when he was born. He was the Mossad chief for the decade after 9/11. He became head of the Mossad in 2002. Here he is when he got the portfolio to be the head of the Mossad by Ariel Sharon. Now, this is from a couple New York Times articles that came out just the other day when this man died. He just died. And one of a former chief of the Israeli intelligence Shin Bet, Yaakov Peri, who himself was involved in 9/11, said he said that this man, Meir Dagan, head of the Mossad, was one of the builders of the foundations of the theories of the war against terrorism. And Dagan was the counterterrorism advisor to Bibi Netanyahu. And it's interesting what he said later in this article from 2011. The bottom quote there. He's talking about the plan for Netanyahu to attack Iran. The Israelis had this idea that they would attack Iran and blow out their nuclear defense or whatever, their nuclear facilities, and these guys like Dagan said, no, that's not sane. And Dagan said, I decided to speak out because when I was in office, he's talking about Diskin, Ashkenazi, and I could block any dangerous adventure like bombing Iran. But he said, now I'm afraid that there is no one to stop Bibi and Barak. Meaning that Barak and Bibi, Netanyahu, are so fanatic and so crazy that they could possibly do such a thing like attack Iran and get into a regional war with Iran. That would be, of course, disastrous for everybody. Now, the war on terror, this is the latest phase. You're probably all familiar with this. It's something called Islamic State. This is basically a troop of actors, I would say. But what you'll notice, this group, they're fighting for the Islamic Caliphate, but they're dressed like, I don't know, they're all wearing black masks. Why are they wearing black masks? Because they're hiding their identity. Why are they hiding their identity? Because 12,000 of these members of this organization are all mercenaries. 12,000. So that means that these people, sometimes they have black skin, sometimes they have maybe red beards. They're not from this place. They're not from Syria. They're not from Iraq. They are poor Muslim men from other parts of the world, even from Western China, who have gone to fight in this organization because they're paid to fight in this organization. Where does the money come from? We all know it comes from Saudi Arabia and Qatar, Turkey. But in 2014, when this group, ISIS, when they released a video of the second American being beheaded, the Israeli intelligence site called Sept, Intelligence Group, released that video to its subscribers before the group itself had released the video. And this is the woman who runs it. She's an Israeli intelligence agent. Her name is Rita Katz. She works out of Bethesda, Maryland, close to the capital. And what her organization does is that they release these videos, supposedly from ISIS. They release these videos to the media. The media subscribes to her service. They pay a lot of money, and then she gives them the latest on ISIS, whatever ISIS is saying, doing, videos like that. So that our understanding, our data, our information about ISIS is coming to us from an Israeli intelligence website. And here's what she said when she uploaded that video. She's speaking on CNN. She's an Iraqi Jew, so her English isn't perfect, perhaps. But she says, within a short time after our release of the video, ISIS account on social media indicated that within a short time, they would be releasing the video. Only we actually had that video beforehand and were able to beat them with the release. So the Israeli intelligence website had the video beforehand. If anything, this shows a very close relationship between Israeli intelligence and this ISIS group, if nothing else. This is the latest video, one of the latest videos. This was about a week ago, or maybe 2 weeks ago now. And this is some of the characters who were involved. These are video clips of some of these characters who were involved in the shooting in Paris. And this was meant to underline in the Western mind that these characters from ISIS are attacking Paris, a Western capital. And so that this war on terror better, pick up its speed a little bit. Well, after 9/11 happened, I realized that we were being lied to, and that the government and media were in cahoots to deceive us about what happened on 9/11. There were certain very key aspects of the crime that were being omitted. So I decided that if I was going to continue writing about this and exposing the lies, I didn't think it was very prudent for me to stay in my house in Chicago, outside Schaumburg, in Chicago, Illinois, in that area. I didn't think it was safe. We didn't even have a perimeter fence around our house. So it's like anybody could come up and as what eventually happened, undercover police came to my house and did that. But I thought it wasn't safe, so in November 2001, just after Thanksgiving, I took my family and we relocated to Germany, to Berlin, where I became the foreign correspondent for my newspaper. And I met, in the first few days, I met these former 3 heads of German intelligence. And one said he looked at the 9/11 videos on TV and he said, it looks to him like a Hollywood production. And that's very true. Another man, this man, Wertebach here, he told me that the deathly precision and magnitude of planning behind the 9/11 attacks would have needed years of planning. And he said such a sophisticated operation would require the fixed frame of a state intelligence organization, something not found in the loose group of terrorists like Mohammed Atta in Hamburg. And this man I also met on the very first day I got to Germany. I met this Andreas von Bülow, and he was the former parliamentarian in charge of German intelligence budgets. And he's written several books about 9/11, although they're only in German, about the CIA and 9/11. And he told me that in such a complicated false flag terror attack, he said there are 3 basic levels of operation. There's the architectural level. They're the ones who planned the crime and designed the crime in order to blame the atrocity on a third party. And they do that in order to shape public opinion, to make public opinion swing against that group, like in our case, and to increase defense spending. That in this case, the blame was put on these Muslims in Afghanistan and the Middle East who were fundamentalists, or supposedly fundamentalists, and Osama bin Laden. And it was meant that we would support the idea of the United States going to war against these people, and we would support increased defense spending. The defense budget basically doubled. And the second level is the managerial level, he said, and these are the people who manage the crime and manage the third level, which is the working level. And he said, like in this case, the 19 Arabs are part of the working level. And he said the working level is actually part of the deception, the 19 Arabs. And he also said something very interesting. He said 95% of the work of intelligence agencies around the world is deception and disinformation, which is widely propagated in the mainstream media, creating an accepted version of events. He said journalists don't even raise the simplest questions. Those who differ are labeled as crazy. Now this is perfect apropos for 9/11. It's like it was obvious that there were many, many questions that needed to be asked on day one, but nobody asked them. Because if you asked the questions, if you were a journalist, you lost your job. So in 2005, when I was speaking in London, the BBC interviewed me, and the first question they said was, why are you the only American journalist who doesn't believe the official version? And I said, I don't know if that's true. But if it is true, I said, it's because other journalists who have raised questions have been fired. I was lucky that I happened to write for a little independent, populist newspaper, and they allowed me to write these things until a certain point. Here we have the 19 alleged hijackers, 15 of whom lived in Florida, mostly around the area of Hollywood, Florida, where many of them had been issued duplicate licenses. Now, if you read the details about these duplicate licenses, it's very interesting. One fellow would go in maybe on a Tuesday and get his license, and the next day, somebody would call up and say, in his name, say, yeah, I'm so-and-so, and I got my license yesterday, but I moved to a new place last night, and now I have a new address. Can you send a duplicate license to my new address? And they did it. In Florida, they did it. And so you had one identity with 2 people playing that role. You understand? Mm-hmm. You have 2 people. And so such duplicate documents are used to create false histories. And if you also read about these characters, many of them had lost their passports. A year or 2 years before, their passports have been lost or stolen. So what we're getting at is an old Mossad trick in which they play a role. They play the role of the hijacker. So, of course, Israel has many Sephardic Jews who grew up in Arabic countries like Morocco, Yemen, Iraq. They speak the language fluently, and they look like Iraqis or Saudis or whatever. So these people can play the role, but they have the ID as well, right? They can play the role of Muhammad Atta or what have you, any of those 19 guys. This was discussed, this whole way, this whole tactic, this whole method was explained in this book by John le Carré called The Little Drummer, published in 1982. And John le Carré is a famous British spy master. He writes books. And in this book, in the very beginning, he says that this book was written with the help of the former chief of Israeli military intelligence. He gives the names of these people that helped him. So the Israelis helped him, explained how they do these things, and he crafted a book called The Little Drummer Girl. I highly recommend this book if you want to understand how this kind of thing is done, how they leave a trail for somebody, how they label Mr. Palestinian as being the terrorist when Mr. Palestinian has nothing to do with it. You need to read this book. And they made it into a movie, but it's such a complicated method that it's really hard to grasp it just from watching the Diane Keaton movie. But in the book, the Mossad chief says to the girl, she's a British actress actually, and he says, terror is theater. Theater's a con trick. Do you know what that means, con trick? You've been deceived. Now this is very important because you need to understand that almost all the terrorism that we see happening around us today is false flag terrorism. It's fabricated terrorism, it's synthetic terrorism, it's false flag terrorism. It's not being done by the people who are being blamed for it. And you need to understand how it's done, and you need to understand why they're doing it. And so next time something happens, some terrorist attack happens, you will be prepared if you remember that terror is theater. For example, let's take the San Bernardino attack. In San Bernardino, there was a shooting at a government building there, and I think 14 people were killed. But the eyewitnesses, there were several eyewitnesses who reported to the national media on the day of the event, and they said there were 3 tall white guys who were very well built, very professional, dressed in black. There were 3 tall, slender white guys that were doing the shooting. But the woman who got shot was a small, brown-skinned Pakistani girl who actually turned out was handcuffed when she was shot. I don't know all these details. But the point is that the eyewitnesses said there were 3 white guys. So when did one of the white guys turn into a small Pakistani girl? And it's the same thing with Boston bombing. Boston bombing is the same thing. The FBI came out 2 days later, the head of the FBI investigation said both devices, both bombs, were planted in black nylon backpacks. It was very precise on that. But Jokar, the remaining suspect who's still alive, was clearly seen carrying a white backpack. So why is he even a suspect? You see, that's what I'm saying, is that it's all theater. It's like a magical show. So you really got to use your critical thinking and say, does this smell real or does this smell fake? Well, Benjamin Netanyahu, who is the father of the war on terror, and now the Prime Minister of the State of Israel, he was working for the Boston Consulting Group. He grew up a lot in New York, which is a Rothschild-linked firm. And then he went from that in 1979. He went back to Israel and founded with his father here, he founded an institution on terrorism called the Netanyahu Institute on Terrorism. Now, a little background of this family is important. The older man, Ben Zion Netanyahu, was born in Warsaw, Poland. His last name was Milokovsky. He went to Israel, changed the name to Netanyahu. But before, when he was living in New York in the 1930s and 40s, he was the executive secretary of something called the NZO, which stands for the New Zionist Organization, which was the organization headed by a man named Jabotinsky. Zev Jabotinsky was a hard, right-wing Russian Jew from Odessa who believed that the Palestinian situation had to be treated with iron fist, iron glove, iron brain. Everything was iron. And they had to build an iron wall. He wrote an essay in 1923, I believe it was called The Iron Wall, in which he said we have to build between the Jews and the Palestinians this iron wall. Which is exactly what they built after 9/11 in 2003. That's what they built in Israel. Well, when Jabotinsky died, Mr. Netanyahu, Sr., took over the NZO, and he was in charge of this most radical, extreme Zionist organization. And his son, Bibi, was inculcated in this entire philosophy as a kid growing up, which is why he has this kind of almost pathological view of the world. Here he is Now remember, Bibi Netanyahu has been pushing the war on terrorism since 1979, since the Jerusalem Conference in 1979 from the Netanyahu Institute. When they first pushed the war on terror as being the goal of the Israeli state, and people like George Bush was there, Papa Bush was there. When he was running for vice president, he was there and he gave a speech. And you can read his speech in one of Netanyahu's books about this conference, and you can see that George Bush was like, gung-ho, yeah, sure. We'll come in to send the U.S. military in, and we'll fight those nasty terrorists. So when 9/11 happened, New York Times asked Mr. Netanyahu, how will this terror atrocity? On 9/11, it was thought that 20 to 30,000 people were dead. He said, how will this atrocity affect Israeli-American, U.S.-Israeli relations? And Mr. Netanyahu said, right away, it's very good. And he said, well, it's not very good, but it will generate immediate sympathy. But that visceral reaction, that first reaction, it's very good. Who would say it's very good about 9/11 on 9/11? Only somebody who benefits from it. Somehow he was benefiting. How he was benefiting was that 9/11 was the kickstart. It kickstarted the war on terror, which he had been pushing for then 22 years. He'd been pushing this thing, and it hadn't lit yet. Now suddenly it was lit big time, and the war was off and running. It's interesting that Mr. Netanyahu, who is the father of the war on terror, and Mr. Silverstein, who is basically the father of 9/11, they were very, very close friends. And every Sunday afternoon, for years prior to 9/11, every Sunday afternoon, Netanyahu would call Silverstein, and they would have this conversation. Now, what were they talking about? Football scores? Here's Netanyahu. This is some graffiti in France. But he said later this very interesting quote. Now, he was speaking to an Israeli audience at Bar Ilan University, and he was speaking in Hebrew. But this is what he said, according to Ma'ariv and later Haaretz. He said, we, speaking to this very right-wing group of people inside Bar Ilan, we are benefiting from one thing, and that is the attack on the Twin Towers and Pentagon and the American struggle in Iraq. Now, those are three things. Clearly, those are three different things. But in his mind, he conflates them into one. That's very telling. That's like a Freudian slip that he would compare. That he would say that the attack on the Twin Towers and the American struggle in Iraq are one thing. I want to point out about Netanyahu is that he was the chairman. He has been the chairman of the Likud since 1993. The Likud is the Israeli political party which is based on the teachings and the doctrine of Jabotinsky. So the Likud is the hard right-wing party in Israel. It's also interesting that on 9/11, the very first articulation of the narrative was given by this man. His name is Ehud Barak, and he was in the London studios of BBC World before either tower had even fallen. The towers had been struck by planes, but then, either tower had fallen. And he said, right away, he was interviewed by the BBC, and he said, the world will not be the same from today on, he said. Now, we know who did this. He said it's Osama bin Laden. And we know where he is. And he said now is the time for the United States and the allies, Western allies, to launch an operational, concrete war against terror. And this analysis, his very succinct analysis here, became, of course, the game plan. This was it. It never changed from this. But how is it that this guy wound up being in the London studio so quickly? Before, it was only a matter of like an hour after the second tower was hit before it fell. So he was right on time. What is the relationship with Barak and Netanyahu? There's a very interesting relationship here, has to be noted. Ehud Barak was Netanyahu's commander in a covert commando force called the Sayeret Matkal. And this Sayeret Matkal is an independent covert commando force which serves directly under the Israeli Chief of Staff and Israeli military intelligence, which serves right under the Chief of Staff. And there were some other members of this Sayeret Matkal, former members, who were also involved in the events of 9/11, like passenger Daniel Levin. So, who was the Chief of Staff on that day in 9/11? It's this man here. He's an Iranian Jew. His name is Shaul Mofaz. Shaul Mofaz is seen here speaking to the neocon Deputy Defense Minister, Secretary of Defense here, Wolfowitz, to his left. Across the table is the man who oversaw the budget for the Pentagon and the Department of Defense. It's Mr. Zakheim, Dov Zakheim. And to his right of Shaul Mofaz is Douglas Feith, with something in his eye. It's interesting to note that the man across the table with the glasses, Dov Zakheim there, who's looking at Mr. Mofaz, he was the guy in charge of the books of the Pentagon, the comptroller. And the day before 9/11, Secretary of State Rumsfeld announced that there was $2.3 trillion missing, unaccounted for, in the defense budget. $2.3 billion was missing. The next day, 9/11 happened, and that part of the Pentagon where the Navy accountants were looking for that missing money was hit with a missile, what looks like a missile. And all of the people were killed. All of the accountants and all their computers were destroyed who were trying to find that missing $2 trillion. So one thing you have to remember about 9/11 is that it is a very, as Mr. Johnson said, it is a very, very complex crime. It is in fact a crime within a crime within a crime. And the cover-up is a deception on top of deception on top of deception. So he said it was like a Soviet intelligence operation. It's very much like the Russian Matryoshka doll, where the Russians have these wooden dolls where you open one and there's another doll inside, and there's just layer upon layer upon layer of dolls. It's something maybe Russian thinking. This man was General Wesley Clark, is Mr. Wesley Clark, and he spoke to Amy Goodman in 2007, and he admitted, he confessed, or he talked about what he heard at the Pentagon just after 9/11. He said, about 10 days after 9/11, he said, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. One of the generals called me in, and he said, sir, we've made the decision we're going to war with Iraq. He said, we're going to war with Iraq? Why? And then the general says, I don't know. And I came back a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing Afghanistan. And I said, are we still going to war with Iraq? And he said, oh, sir, it's much worse than that. We're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq, and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off with Iran. Now, of those 7 countries, we've already accomplished 5. So I think this is probably was the plan. But where did this adventure come from that we're going to just start rearranging the Middle East? Well, it was one of Israel's strategic goals. In 1948, this is the founding Prime Minister of the State of Israel. His name is David Ben-Gurion. He was a former Rothschild employee. And this is him speaking to his general staff basically 1 week after the State of Israel was created in May 1948. And he's speaking to his military staff, and he says, we should prepare to go over to the offensive with the aim of smashing Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. He talks about the weak point being Lebanon and how they'll create a Christian state in the south up to the Litani River and make an alliance with that. Then we will smash the Arab Legion's strength and bomb Amman, which is Jordan. We will eliminate Jordan too. And then Syria will fall. If Egypt dares to fight, we will bomb Port Said, Alexandria, and Cairo. Well, how does this guy get suddenly so aggressive? They've just survived this war of independence. They've conquered their little piece of Palestine, and now they're ready to go smashing all the countries around the Middle East. Where does this come from? Where does this thinking come from? Well, it comes from something what is called in Hebrew Eretz Israel. Eretz Israel means the land of Israel, and this is the notion that Israelis have that Israel is entitled to its former biblical boundaries at the greatest expanse. And the greatest expanse of these biblical boundaries, in their mind, goes from the river Nile in Egypt to the river Euphrates in Iraq. And it includes all the land in between. Hence the Israeli flag has those 2 blue stripes. Those stand for the river Nile and Euphrates. And the Rothschild square in the middle, the Rothschild star in the middle, stands for the Zionist state in the middle. And this is from an Israeli website called What Israel's Future Borders Will Look Like, from an Israeli website in October 2013. So this is not a secret. How do they intend to do this? This was probably meant to be secret, or it was meant only to remain in the Hebrew-speaking audience. This is called the Yenon Plan. And the strategy is a strategy for Israel in the 1980s, written by Oded Yenon. It was printed in a Hebrew magazine in February 1982. But thanks to this very humanistic scholar named Israel Shahak, who taught chemistry at Hebrew University, he translated this document into English so that the outside world, the non-Hebrew speaking world, could be aware of this plan to dominate the Middle East. And the plan basically was this, that Israel intended to break up all of the large Arab states into ethnic constituencies, into ethnic subgroups. The process is generally called Balkanization. It's exactly what we did in Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was a large, secular, socialist state in Southeast Europe. And in 1995, we went in with George Soros and some other people, and we broke the country up, NATO, we broke the country up into like 7 small parts. Basically along every line we could break it up in. But the Yugoslavs are really one people, but basically they're Serbo-Croats. But they have religious differences, and they have some language differences, but they're very minor. And then there's the Albanians. But we broke that into pieces. That's called Balkanization. You take a big country and you break it up into its little ethnic parts. And you can see Iraq here is today de facto broken into 3 pieces. Kurdistan, Sunni area in the west, and the Shiite area in the south. Syria is in the process of being broken up. It's like Humpty Dumpty. Whether the country can go back together again is hard to say, but most likely it can't be. Libya is broken up. Sudan is broken up. Of course, that was very quickly they did that. They broke South Sudan off of the Sudan. So this is the name of the game. And this gives you an idea of these various ethnic constituents, groups. Of course, in Iraq, it's very simple, the 3 large groups. But in Syria, it's more complicated. And this is the name of the game. It's interesting that the Anon plan said that, the plan was to break it up into these ethnic, unique areas. But it said that the initial project was the dissolution of the military power of those states is the primary short-term target. Well, look at what America did. When the United States went into Iraq, the first thing we did is break up the military. Sent all the military guys home, destroyed the military. It was no longer it's such a counterproductive thing to do, but that's what we did. We dissolved the entire Iraqi military. So this is what the Middle East looks like, after World War II, what we see in the textbooks. This is kind of like where we're going with it, breaking it up into pieces. And when this happens, one reason why Israel aspires to this breaking up in ethnic enclaves is because then Israel will be just one ethnic enclave among a sea of ethnic enclaves. So nobody will have moral authority to say, you're just for one race or one group. Are the terrorists winning the war on terror? It certainly looks like that. Despite all the money we spent and all the blood that's been shed, terrorism now is 10 times more frequent than it was before 9/11. And the defense budget, as I said, has doubled. The base rate was $300 billion per year in the year 2000. It's now well over twice that. So a lot of money that Americans really can't afford to spend is being spent on the military. I mean, you consider that we have 2 oceans on both sides and relatively friendly neighbors north and south. Yet we spend far more money on defense than all the other countries in the world put together. Madness. Now, I talked about how Netanyahu, how Bibi Netanyahu is the chairman of the Likud. What is the Likud? I told you it's a right-wing party, but it's more than the right-wing party. The Likud is the party of the former terrorist chiefs. And the men that started the party are basically these 3 men here. Menachem Begin in the middle, the former head of the Irgun, which was a hard right-wing militia terrorist group. Then you have Yitzhak Shamir on the right. He was the former head of the Stern gang, or the Lehi. And then, of course, we have their protege here, Ariel Sharon, who led the big invasion of Lebanon in 1982, in which something like 20,000 Lebanese were killed. Among them were those people of Sabra and Shatila who were massacred in a 3-day murderous massacre that went on for 3 days and killed thousands of Palestinians. Now, the Irgun, which was Menachem Begin's group, they had an emblem, and this is their emblem. And you can see this notion of Eretz Israel, the bigger state of Israel there. It says Eretz Israel. And it says in Hebrew there, Rak Kach, only thus being the gun. Only through the use of the gun, only through this gun will we accomplish this territory. And this was his organization. And here he is in 1948. He was born in Russia, and he came to Palestine in 1942. He became the head of the Irgun, and then promptly ordered the bombing of the King David Hotel in 1946. In 1973, he created the Likud coalition, and 4 years later, he became prime minister. And then right away, he commenced on this idea of conquering South Lebanon, which led to these invasions of Lebanon in 1978 and 1982, in which at least 20,000 Lebanese were killed. Here he is, giving a speech You see again the map of the Greater Israel there on the podium. And here's the bombing. Here's his handiwork. He called for this. He organized this bombing of the King David Hotel, which was British military headquarters in British Mandate Palestine in the 40s. And his people dressed up along with Haganah and Irgun did this together. They dressed up like Arabs, put on the keffiyehs and whatnot, and brought in these big these big 50-gallon milk cans, or how many gallons they are, those big milk canisters, and brought them downstairs and put them around the columns in the basement of the King David Hotel, and blew to smithereens. Now this is a very similar, this atrocity, which was the biggest terror atrocity in Palestine-Israeli history, this is very similar to 9/11. There's a lot of similarities in the motivation. In 1974, he was interviewed by a British journalist who asked him, Mr. Begin, he said, how does it feel in the light of all that's going on to be the father of terrorism in the Middle East? And Begin said, in the Middle East? He said, in all the world. So he was putting on himself the mantle of being the father of terrorism in all the world. He was proud of that fact. He was proud of it. There was nothing to hide from it. There was nothing untrue. Here he was wanted, he's number one wanted by the Palestinian police, the British police. Down here on the second row, second guy in the left is of Shamir. And they were wanted for their criminal activities, the murders and bank robberies and the things that they had committed in Palestine in the 1940s and 30s. Shamir, for example, I told you, was the head of the Stern gang, the Lehi gang. And in his gang, there was a member named Benjamin Auerbach, who became Benjamin Emanuel. That's Romine Emanuel's father. And this group, Shamir's group, murdered, among other people, they murdered the UN envoy to Palestine. This in the picture here, that's Folke Bernadotte. He's the Swedish count. He's actually the uncle of the current king of Sweden. And he was killed Bonnie and Clyde style because he was trying to find a solution to this, what they call the 9/11, the partition plan of 1947, when the United Nations, in its infinite wisdom, cut Palestine into pieces and gave little pieces to the Palestinians and little pieces to the Jews, the Zionists who were settling there. And so they, in 1947, they were doing this all. They did it in Pakistan and India. The idea was that you could separate people and draw redistrict areas, and it didn't work at all. But the point is that Bernadotte wanted Jerusalem to be what they called in the treaty a corpus separatus, a separate, entity that did not belong to either side. So everybody could go there. But the Israelis, the Zionists, didn't want that at all. They wanted Jerusalem. So they saw that this man was an obstacle to their plan, so they killed him. And Shamir was the one who led that assassination. And as I said, Romine Emanuel's father was a member of that team. And then he came to America. He had to get out of Palestine. He came to America, went to Chicago, and had these 3 kids. Romine Emanuel is the youngest boy, and he was, of course, the senior advisor to Bill Clinton and chief of staff for Barack Obama. And he's the bona fide son of a terrorist. I called his father in Chicago one day and I asked him, were you a member of the Irgun? Were you working with Menachem Begin? He said, no, I was with Shamir. I was in Lehi. So he admitted to, he's a doctor. He admitted that he was a member of the Stern gang, which was the most extreme, murderous, ruthless gang in Palestine. And his son, Romine Emanuel, was described by a big Chicago observer named Sherman Skolnick, who dealt with the corruption in Chicago, which is, of course, Legion. And he said that he called Romine Emanuel the Mossad agent in the White House, which is not far from it at all. Here's the chief of the Mossad, the first chief of the Mossad. His name is Issa Harel. And he was having dinner with an American Zionist named Michael Evans in 1980. And Michael Evans, after 9/11, talked about what Issa Harel, the head of the Mossad, had told him in 1980. When he was asked, when Evans asked, do you think terrorism will come to America? And if so, where and why? And Issa Harel said, I fear it will come to you in America. America has the power, but not the will, to fight terrorism. The terrorists have the will, but not the power, to fight America. But all that could change with time. Arab oil buys more than tanks. As to the where, Harel continued, New York City is the symbol of freedom and capitalism. It's likely they will strike the Empire State Building, your tallest building and a symbol of your power. What amazing prescience. Here, the head of the Mossad, 21 years before the attack happens, predicts exactly what the Arabs are planning to do 21 years later. Well, the Mossad, head of the Mossad was not just dreaming about this, he was actually acting on it. He sent his two of his major older lieutenants, these two men, to New York with the mission of getting the security contract for the World Trade Center. These two men are Tzvi Malkin on top and Avraham Shalom Ben Dor on the bottom. And they were involved in similar operations, Mossad operations, with Israel. For example, most notably the kidnapping of Eichmann in Argentina and taking him back to Israel and charging with genocide. And then also the smuggling of plutonium from the United States to Israel for its nuclear weapons program. So these guys are really high-level Mossad guys. And they're older, you can see. And when, however, they got the security contract for the Port Authority, the company was called Atwell Security of Tel Aviv. And they actually had a contract with the Port Authority. But when the Port Authority discovered that Avraham Shalom Ben Dor, the president of Atwell Security, was in fact a convicted murderer in Israel, they said, no, this won't go. So they tore up the contract. But that was a really good thing. Had they not torn up that contract, the 9/11 atrocity probably would have occurred in the late 80s or early 90s. And we would have been at a disadvantage because we had no internet then. And we would have only been reading about it in Time magazine. Well, those men were thwarted. You know, the contract was torn up, but they didn't go home. They didn't say quit. Instead, they went to work for this man on the top, Jules Kroll. Jules Kroll and Maurice Greenberg, they're business partners, these two men. You might recall who Maurice Greenberg is. Maurice Greenberg is the former CEO of a company called AIG. About his own company, he said, if we were legal, we wouldn't be in business. But he insured these banks and their derivative options and all this kinds of mortgage stuff. And when those banks went belly up, basically, in 2008, the United States government gave him, his company, basically, he was no longer the CEO, but they gave his company $180 billion, which they then wrote checks to Bank of America and Goldman Sachs. So the U.S. taxpayer was bailing out, the big banks through him. Well, those two characters from before, these two Mossad guys, when they were thwarted in their mission, they went to work for these two guys, primarily Jules Kroll. Jules Kroll had a company called Kroll Associates, and his company got the security contract for the World Trade Center in 1993 after the first bombing. They gave the security contract to Kroll Associates, and then they rewrote the security procedures and everything, and those Israeli guys were working for him then.
PA's Port Authority?
PA is Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, right? And they're the owners of the World Trade Center property, and so it was basically public property that was privatized. But so that they then had control. The control of the security procedure was then in the hands of Kroll Associates. And the person who was in charge of Kroll Associates in 2001 was this man, Michael Cherkasky. Now, he has also a very interesting history. In 1993, when the first bombing occurred, he was in charge of the investigation for the city of New York. He led the New York State investigation under the district attorney, Robert Morgenthau, who's actually the son of Henry Morgenthau from World War II fame, or notoriety. So Cherkasky then, after he investigated the bombing in 93, he then went and worked for Kroll Associates. And he then became, he recommended new security procedures, which the Port Authority followed. And then he became the president and CEO of Kroll. And in 2001, obviously the security of the World Trade Center was severely compromised because somebody got in there with jackhammers and wires and thermite and thermate and wired the heck out of the place and blew it up. So it was under his security, this Israeli Zionist security outfit, that the World Trade Center was compromised. Another member of Kroll Associates is this character here, Jerome Hauer. And Jerome Hauer was the man who oversaw the building in Building 7 on the 23rd floor of what they call a hardened bunker. And they built it on the entire 23rd floor of Building 7 was this bunker that was built with its own water supply, its own air supply, and it was designed to withstand a nuclear blast in the area. And it's most likely that this is where the actual demolition process of the Twin Towers was being managed. Because when you pull a building like that, you have to be right there to push all the buttons and pull the levers at the right time to bring the building down. It's a rather complicated thing. And you can't be, in Miami and do it in New York. You have to be right there. And so this is the guy who was the head of Giuliani's Office of Emergency Management. And he was the one who put that hardened bunker right there in Building 7, which was a rather strange place to put any bunker. Now I'm going to talk about something called the ideation of 9/11. Ideation is putting the idea, forming this idea and putting the idea out there. And in 1978, the idea of flying a plane into a high-rise building was the climactic scene of a movie made by this Israeli guy named Arnon Milchan. And this is his first movie. Arnon Milchan made other movies like JFK and Pretty Woman and Brazil, which is a very odd film. But he made this film, this first film he made, and he's got this idea about flying planes into buildings. Richard Burton plays this man who has telekinetic powers. And as I said, the climactic scene is a 747 flying into the Pan Am building. And here they're setting up the props for the filming of this movie. In 1978, he made this film in England. And it's interesting that this picture is also from 1978, where he is talking to the Israeli Defense Minister, Ezra Weizmann. Well, the thing is that Arnon Milchan is a very high-level Israeli agent. He was in charge of procuring elements for Israel's nuclear arsenal illegally in the United States and sending them to Israel. So like in 1985, his company was busted sending 850 nuclear triggers. These are the devices that trigger nuclear bombs to Israel. The FBI caught them, and the United States demanded that Israel return these nuclear triggers. Israel said, you can have half of them back. So they gave back half of them. And that was his operation. But although it was his operation, his company that did the smuggling, only his employees got busted. He wasn't even named in the indictment. Because he's Mr. Teflon. Here he is speaking with Shimon Peres and Bibi Netanyahu. And he calls Shimon Peres his best friend. They're besties. And Milchan has a long history of being an Israeli money launderer. And they say in Hollywood that he's the second richest man in Hollywood. He has $5.2 billion. But his whole history has been involved in money laundering. So the real question is, where does his money come from? People who have worked with him in the past said he's a very strange character. They say he comes to the table with like endless amounts of money, and they couldn't figure it out. Like I think it was Terry Gilliam who made the movie Brazil with him. He said he couldn't figure this guy out at all. It's like it seemed very, very kind of dark. It was very dark, this guy. Well, in the year 2000, he made a film, again, planes flying into buildings. This time he made a movie about a plane flying into the World Trade Center. And it was broadcast on Fox News in March 2001. It was the pilot episode of this new series called Lone Gunman. Get it? Lone Gunman. Very clever. And he made a movie with his partner. His partner in this company is Rupert Murdoch. Murdoch and Milchan made this movie in which a plane is flying on autopilot, and the pilot then discovers that he is actually not flying the plane, that somebody else is flying the plane, that somebody has remotely hijacked the plane, changed the waypoints, and is flying the plane into the World Trade Center. And at the very last minute, after some technological changes, the pilot is able to recover control at the very last minute and pull back on the wheel, pull back on the plane, and the plane just narrowly misses hitting the World Trade Center. And this was filmed at the World Trade Center at night with a helicopter, making all these scenes. It was very realistic. It wasn't just like that old movie. They actually did it at the World Trade Center. And millions of people watched this movie. This movie broadcast on Fox News in March 2001. So millions of people, I think 8 million people saw it. Another form of ideation is this. This is a Council of Foreign Relations. You might have heard of them. Yes. And this is their magazine, Foreign Affairs. December 1998, Philip Zelikow had headed a group called the Catastrophic Terrorism Study Group. Sounds cool. And on his group was Ashton Carter and John Deutsch. You probably remember Ashton Carter is today our Secretary of Defense. And this article was their report of their study group, Catastrophic Terrorism Study Group. And in this, the very first subtitle is Imagining the Transforming Event. So these guys are imagining this transforming event that could change America. And they say, long part of the Hollywood and Tom Clancy repertory of nightmare scenarios, catastrophic terrorism has moved from far-fetched horror to a contingency that could happen next month. Well, when did it move? When did it move? I mean, we've only had one such thing in our whole history. When did this become such a pressing reality? But in this document, they laid out for all these intelligentsia who read this magazine the potential, the possibility of catastrophic terrorism, and then they said what we should do when it happens. Right? This is like they're laying out the blueprint for people who work in the government, who work in the academic institutions. Here's John Deutsch up here on the top left, and Ashton Carter there smirking with the blue sweater. John Deutsch is, of course, a Belgian-born Jewish guy who became head of the CIA. He's not very bright. I've met him. Ashton Carter is our Secretary of Defense. At the time that they wrote that document, at the time they worked on the catastrophic terrorism study group, they were senior partners, these are the senior partners, of Global Technology Partners, which became an exclusive affiliate of Rothschild North America and was formed to make acquisitions of and investments in technology, defense, and aerospace-related companies. So these are basically the guys who give them access to the gravy train, the $600 billion a year gravy train of the Defense Department. Another group that was involved in this ideation was this group called the PNAC, Peanut Guys, Project for the New American Century. That means PNAC. I mean, that's the acronym. And the PNAC group is these peanuts down here. Donald Kagan, his son Robert Kagan, and son Fred Kagan. I would say Kagan, but Americans say Kagan. And this is the wife of Robert. Her name is Victoria Nuland. Now, if you watch the news, you might know Victoria Nuland is the one who brought us the crisis in Ukraine. Single-handedly, she's the Assistant Secretary of Defense, Eurasia. She's in charge of all Eurasia, right? And she's the one who was out there when those protesters were protesting against the Yanukovych government. She was out there giving them bagels and drinks and stuff and saying, God, keep going, keep going. So she was interjecting herself into this domestic dispute in Ukraine. Then she was recorded on the telephone saying that we'll get rid of Yanukovych and we'll put Yatsenyuk in power. And that was the famous telephone conversation where she said, like, F you to the European Union, F them, you know, who cares about the European Union? But the most important thing she said in that telephone call was that Yatsenyuk will be the next prime minister. She was telling that to the American ambassador. And lo and behold, a week later, after the bloody coup, Yatsenyuk was put in power. Now, the problem with Yatsenyuk is, of course, that he's a Ukrainian nationalist who's opposed to the Russian language being spoken in Ukraine. Well, you've got about 25% of the population who's Russian. That's not going to go over very well. It's just like if we were to put a new government in Ottawa, Canada. If we were to have a coup in Canada, if the United States were to impose a coup and install a new government in Ottawa, and the next morning they would say, from now on, no more French in this country. There would, of course, be a war. Well, the war is what we got in Ukraine. But that war is very dangerous because that has brought the United States and Russia closer to actual war than we've been in, at least since 1961. Well, this is all thanks to the Kagan family. The Kagan family also brought us the war in Iraq. They also brought us the surge in Iraq. But before 9/11, 1 year before 9/11, they crafted a document called Rebuilding America's Defenses. And they had been pushing for the United States under Clinton to wage war against Iraq. And because their whole purpose, their raison d'etre, is to get this war in Iraq going. And they said in this document, they said that the United States will have to invade Iraq and build bases in Iraq on a permanent basis, whether Saddam Hussein is on the throne or not. So Saddam Hussein wasn't the issue. The whole point was to get America to take over Iraq. And they talked, this is all part of their idea that they have to transform the U.S. military into this global dominant power. And they said the process of transformation, of creating this new global dominant power, even if it brings revolutionary change, is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. That was 1 year before 9/11, and lo and behold, within a year, they had their new Pearl Harbor, and they got this whole transformation thing moving. Okay, now I'm going to talk about a few aspects of the reality of 9/11 to point out some of the most conspicuous elements of the crime that indicate that we've been completely hoaxed about 9/11. First picture here is, of course, the World Trade Center 2 being hit, South Tower being hit. You see this tremendous explosion coming out of the entry wound, which is explosive in nature. There's no burning kerosene here. The burning kerosene is over there. And you see this little critter going out behind that pole there, burning white hot. What is that? That's not part of the plane. Well, the plane that hit the World Trade Center 2, South Tower, is clearly not Boeing Flight 175 United Airlines. First of all, you see that it has a groove down the middle of the fuselage, the underside of the fuselage, that is indicative of a 767 tanker aircraft. So this is not Flight 175. Furthermore, it had a little missile pod on the bottom of it. There's a little missile pod here that fired a little missile object into the building before the plane hit. Both planes had the same sort of apparatus. Here you see another picture showing this kind of missile pod, missile thing on the bottom of the plane.
You
That's
accept these photographs as authentic?
Yeah, these are from videos. These are from videos.
Well, then they must be true. Okay.
Yeah, these are videos. They're from these various sources here: Spiegel TV, CNN, Fairbanks. You know, there were a bunch of photographers that caught pictures of this plane.
A bunch. Okay.
Yeah, and here we see what happened when this missile hit the building. The missile opened up a hole in the tower. The tower is mostly glass and steel columns, and this hole was made. This white hot hole was made. Now, this is for two purposes I can see. One purpose of opening the hole is like open sesame. It allows the plane to go into the building. The fuselage, of course, is the weakest part of the plane. The wings have more mass. They can be hardened, but the wings have weight, and they can cut into the building. But the fuselage is weak, so they had to open a hole to allow the fuselage to enter the building. Then you can see it's white hot. That white hot indicates that this thing was like a spark, was like the igniter of anything that was on the floor that was combustible. So it led to this massive conflagration. When the plane went into the building, all the jet fuel that was on the plane combusted immediately. So basically, all the jet fuel, the kerosene that was on the plane, burned in the first few seconds. And here you see this little critter coming out, this white hot burning object, and another piece of the missile. It appears to be this one, like maybe an engine. And I did a lot of work. Somebody who's aware of my work, I did a lot of work on depleted uranium. And in learning about depleted uranium, I visited a former scientist from the In working on depleted uranium, I visited, I had a friend, a mentor at Lawrence Livermore Lab, and his name was Marion Falk. And Marion Falk was an older fellow, and he had worked on the U.S. nuclear programs since the Manhattan Project, all the way through to Star Wars. And he'd been a guy that made the thing work. And he lived in Livermore. His wife had died of cancer, and he was very concerned about the tritium pollution in Livermore. And so he decided to dedicate his life to helping the Americans understand the dangers of nuclear radiation. And so he was very happy to help me. And I would spend many days at his house, and he would teach me about depleted uranium and the dangers of it. And so when I discovered these images and this little critter coming out of the building, I turned to Marion and I asked him, I sent him the best pictures I have of this, and I said, does this look like a depleted uranium warhead burning? And he said, yes, it has the characteristics of a depleted uranium warhead. Which is what is on the warhead of most of the missiles that are fired today from the U.S. military. The warhead is depleted uranium. Depleted is just a term. It doesn't mean it's depleted at all. It's just not enriched. And it's the kind of uranium that's left over from our nuclear energy programs. So they had to get rid of it. So they put it on the fronts of missiles because it's very dense. It burns in the air, and it cuts through anything. It cuts through steel on a tank like a warm knife through butter. So it's the American military's now. It's our silver bullet. However, it's got very serious health concerns for everybody concerned. Well, here we see this white hot object against the blue sky. You can see that is certainly not part of the aircraft. It's burning white hot. And the dark oxides behind it are indicative of burning uranium as well. Now, this is the explosion on the side where the plane entered the building, and this is clearly not burning jet fuel. This is a very energetic explosion with a bright light, a yellowish orange flame, and no soot. So this seems to be an explosion that's going off inside the building. Here's the beginning of the conflagration from the south tower, and you see that the outside edge of the explosion has white smoke, bright white smoke. That is indicative of thermite. When thermite burns, when thermite goes off, reacts, it creates a white smoke, just like that. That's the aluminum oxide. That's part of the reaction. And then you see, again, you can see the white smoke, and then the black smoke is, of course, the burning kerosene. So that missile piece that went through the building, that extremely white-hot thing, acted like the spark that made this all happen. Incredible conflagration. Now, a similar thing happened when the North Tower was hit. Both planes struck secure computer rooms. In the South Tower, it hit the Fuji Bank secure computer room. The entire floor was computers, banks, servers, batteries, what have you. The North Tower was the computer room belonging to Maurice Greenberg's son, Marsh McLennan Company. Marsh McLennan. That was the CEO of that company was Maurice Greenberg's son, and that was the company that he had together with Kroll. And their computer room occupied the north side of the North Tower and the east side of the North Tower. Here we see the plane went in the north face of the building, and you see this very energetic explosion coming out the east face of the building. That explosion, that big white cotton bale, is coming out 90-degree angle to the path of the plane. And that's precisely where the computer room was. Here is the Pentagon, and clearly we were given a real fairy tale here. We were told that the plane came in at grass level, at grade they call it, and yet at grade level it would have hit these big cable spools that are on the lawn. Those cable spools are about 2.5 meters high, like 7 feet high. And yet the plane supposedly went right through there and hit the building here. And you have to remember also that the outside wall of the Pentagon, it was a fort, was 1 meter thick, reinforced concrete and masonry. Yet we don't see any elements of an aircraft here, we don't see any parts of a plane, we don't have any indication that a plane actually caused this damage. Whatever hit the Pentagon went through the building and bore this hole on the inside C-ring. And we're told, this is from the NIST document on the Pentagon, that the plane came through like this, and that fuselage, this is the long fuselage section here, went through the building like a cookie cutter, and then created that hole in the wall down there on the inside drive. But there's a problem here, because you see those yellow squares there. Those yellow squares indicate columns, support columns in the building that are still standing. So it's like there's no way the cookie cutter plane went through there and made that hole without taking out those columns there. Well, because the yellow says that the column is still functioning, it shows signs of cracking and spalling. So, but how did the FBI finesse this problem? Easy. They just locked off this whole section and said, no engineers allowed. And engineers were only allowed to walk around for a couple hours anyway. The guys that wrote that report were only allowed to walk around after the whole place was cleaned up. They were allowed to walk around for a couple hours and go home and write the report. But they were not allowed to go into that final section. So, like, for example, this photograph says from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, because only the FBI was allowed to go in this area. Why? Probably because the evidence was so overwhelmingly contradictory of what the story was. Here's the Pentagon. This is the guys going in, the first responders. Look at how well protected they are. They have very sophisticated respirators on, and they are going into an area obviously aware that it is a very toxic area. When they came out, they were washed up like this. Their food, their shoes, and clothes were washed by professional decontamination units. So they were obviously aware that whatever struck the Pentagon was extremely toxic. Here at the Shanksville, Pennsylvania, this is the crash site. We're told this is the crash site of Flight 93. However, this hole was only 20 feet across. I spoke to the girl who was the first person at the hole, Nina Lensbauer, who worked at the junkyard just adjacent to this area. This is a reclaimed mine. And she said the hole was only as big as the trailer in her front yard, which is a 24-foot trailer. And, you know, when the county coroner came to this hole, he said, I stopped being a coroner after 20 minutes because there were no bodies. The mayor of Shanksville went to this hole and said, there's no evidence of a plane. So I went to the local paper, Somerset newspaper. I've been there a couple times. And I said, I'd like to talk to you about how your newspaper has covered this event. I wanted to ask them about how they had handled, like there were dozens of people in Shanksville who had seen like an A-10 Warthog circling around. And there was one woman who saw it just go right over her car, and she described the plane as one of those planes that had a spoiler on the back and two upright fins. That's an A-10 Warthog. And she said it just went over the trees, and suddenly there was this big explosion. That's probably because that's what that plane did. That A-10 Warthog went over the trees and fired a missile into the ground and made this little hole. Why did they do that? Because they wanted us to think that this is where the plane crashed, when in fact the debris field that they were picking up was about a quarter mile further in the woods. So I went to the newspaper and I said, I'd like to talk to you about how your papers covered this story. And I came to the paper, and they said, come in Wednesday at 3 o'clock, and I came, and I was introduced to a U.S. military intelligence officer named Labor Knight, Mr. Labor Knight. And I said, why am I talking to you? And he said, well, I've been seconded to the paper to answer your questions. And so I said, well, can you explain why we have this hole in the ground but no evidence of an airplane? And he said, you have to understand that the ground there is very soft, and the plane came very fast. And when the plane hit the ground liquefied and swallowed the plane. But he said one wing bounced a half mile in the woods. And he spoke this with complete sincerity. I mean, he was doing his job. But then I contacted later, when I finished my book, I contacted the Lutheran minister in the woods who has cabins out there. He has a 9-acre parcel, and he had a whole cluster of like 3 cabins. And they were kicked off their property by the FBI, as the FBI stayed there for a couple of weeks picking up the pieces. Wow. And I asked Reverend Hoover, I said, Reverend Hoover, can you explain to me why you have not been forthright with the American people and told us that the actual debris field of Flight 93 is in the woods around your cabin? And he said, well, I was just trying to cooperate. It's the same thing that the county coroner told me, Wally Miller. He's my age, very tall, slender guy. And I met him several times, and when I was visiting him once, his house was getting his funeral home was getting all repainted, all fixed up, and there were 3 Hanson brothers on the porch. These brothers were doing the painting, and they said, Wally, tell him about what the FBI told you. And he said, well, the FBI told him, Wally, are you going to be a team player? Meaning, are you going to give us custody of the crash site? Because as county coroner, it's Pennsylvania law, he has custody of the crash site. Are you going to give us, FBI, custody of the crash site, and you will sit 7 miles away in a reception center and answer questions for the media, which is what he did. So then I called him up about a year later. I said, Wally, how do you explain, how do you justify signing death certificates for bodies you never saw? And he slammed the phone down on me. Of course, the truth hurts. This is the South Tower about 7 minutes before it collapsed. 9:52:51 in the morning. This is an AP photograph, and this photograph shows clearly a thermatic reaction occurring on the 81st floor. The 81st floor had broken, obviously, and was coming down to the 80th floor. And we can see that it's a thermatic reaction because of the bright light and the shooting out of the molten metal and the white smoke. It's producing this white smoke. And 1 minute later, we have this cascade of molten iron falling off the tower. This is like a waterfall. It's like a cascade. It fell down the entire face of the building, and it was filmed here by WABC TV, and it just kept going and going and going. It was like Victoria Falls, just falling molten iron. And, the government reports talk about at this second and this second, there would be a burst of white smoke followed by an increase of the flow. We're talking about thermatic reaction. We're talking about a huge thermatic reaction going on here, in which the products are the white smoke, the aluminum oxide, and the molten metal. And incredible heat. Now you have to consider that in this case, this is happening on the 81st floor. This molten metal, is at least 1,500 degrees Celsius. Above this floor, there are still hundreds and hundreds of people who are trapped. Those people are being cooked alive. That it's so hot that heat is coming up through the elevator shafts, through the floor. That's why the people were jumping to their death, because they went to the window. They were hoping and praying that a helicopter would maybe land on the roof and rescue them. But when the heat was so intense, the choice was whether they be cooked like a chicken in that floor or jump to their death. And at least 250 jumped to their death. And the New York Fire Department was watching down below, and they said it was raining bodies. It was raining bodies. And one firefighter said, you have to imagine how bad it was up there, that the better option was to jump. Here we have another example, another photographic piece of evidence of a thermite cutter charge. You see the firefighter in the middle. Behind him is a box column that's been cut by a thermite cutter charge. And you see the slag that's poured off that. And you can see the angle of the cut is such that the column would have failed straight down like that. And all 47 columns, each tower is held up with 47 box columns, and each column would have been cut in the same way. There's a photograph someplace that shows a whole bunch of these columns lined up, put together, with the cuts on top of them, but I haven't found it yet. I've seen it before. Here we have the recovery of, they're pulling away the rubble from the building, and you can see that as they pull the rubble away, underneath the pile, there was this incredible reaction going on that was producing molten, that was melting the steel. But the government reports cannot account for this incredible heat, so they simply deny it existed. They deny that there was any molten metal involved. Like this fella. In 2002, as I did my research about this and spoke to the guys who removed the rubble, most notably Peter Tully and Mark Loiseau, they told me they had found pools of molten steel at the bedrock of Manhattan. When they got down to the lowest basement level, they got down to the bedrock, they found pools of molten steel. That's what they called it. And this guy was asked in 2006 at Texas, he was asked about this report. He said, let's go back to your basic premise, that there was a pool of molten steel. He says, I know absolutely nobody. No eyewitness said so, nobody's produced it. And if you watch the video of him talking, he's so nervous he's about to break his glasses because he's telling a big lie. And he knows he's lying. Here's a New York firefighter, you've probably seen this video, he said, you get down below and see molten steel. Molten steel running down the channel rails, like you're in a foundry, like lava, like a volcano. And Peter Tully told me he was the only contractor, of the 4 contractors who removed the steel from the World Trade Center, he was the only American. And he was open, like an American. He told me, he said he had seen pools of literally molten steel at the base of the World Trade Center. And here you see the photographic evidence that shows something like that, what they found at the bottom. I mean, they all saw it. Furthermore, you have this evidence in the dust. As I said, all that was left of the World Trade Center was dust and steel. In the dust, you found these tiny balls of iron. And here we have at least 6% of the dust of the World Trade Center was comprised of these steel balls, metal balls. And these were formed at obviously very high temperatures, at least 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit, during the demolition of the World Trade Center. Burning jet fuel or office fires cannot get anywhere near this temperature, but thermite can. In fact, nanothermite produces exactly this, tiny balls of iron. And this is why the government has completely ignored this evidence and disregarded it, because this proves that something else happened at 9/11, and that it was very, very hot. And this is important to understand, because there's people like Judy Wood who tell you in her book that the destruction of the World Trade Center was a cold event. It was anything but cold. It was in fact extremely hot. And her book came out 1 year after this discovery was made. Another critter that was found in the dust is this tiny sphere. This is molybdenum. And this was found in the U.S. Geological Survey of the dust. But this molybdenum is has one of the highest melting temperatures on the periodic table. The melting temperature of molybdenum is 4,753 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, that is incredibly hot. But the question is, what could have created this little drop of molybdenum? There's only one thing that I know of, and that would be a thermetic reaction of a thermite which involved molybdenum trioxide as the oxidizer. And it's one of the most powerful forms of superthermite. Now here we have the pile. The pile burned and smoked. They said it burned. They said the fires were raging. They said the fires were raging until Christmas. But it wasn't really fires. It was a chemical reaction that was going on beneath the pile. Now remember, they were spraying the pile with fire hoses 24/7, just to try to keep it cool enough so people could work there. But it just kept smoking and smoking. And this smoke was not being analyzed by the EPA. That trusted, vaunted EPA, who's supposed to protect our environment, Christy Todd Whitman said, the air is safe to breathe. And she was lying through her teeth. A guy from the University of California at Davis, who runs this aerosol study department called the Delta Group, was asked by a colleague in New York to send one of the Davis drums to New York. And they set that drum up on Varick Street, about a few blocks north of this ground zero. And whenever the wind blew that smoke through that drum, the drum would analyze the size of the particles and the nature of the particles. It's an aerosol unit, after all. And what they found was that this smoke contained huge amounts of nanoparticles. Now, nanoparticles are particles that are smaller than 1/10 of a micron in diameter and smaller. What that means is that it's extremely, extremely small. Now that's a very serious health risk because such small particles, when they're inhaled, do not stop in the lung or the soft tissue or the capillaries. They permeate every boundary, every membrane in the body until they get to the center of the nucleus of the human cell. And when they get to the nucleus of the human cell, there's no place else to go. That's where they start causing real havoc with the human system. That's what causes the cancers and the Parkinson's disease and the very serious diseases that have killed all the firefighters. Because they inhaled this stuff. And Professor Cahill from California, he went out to visit the project in like November of 2001, and he was met at the airport by EPA officials, and they said, who authorized you to do this project, and who's paying for it? Who asked you to do it, and who's paying for it? And he was surprised because he thought that the whole government would be out there measuring the smoke and checking the environment, and he said the EPA was doing nothing. It was doing nothing. And yet the EPA chief had said the air is safe to breathe, complete lie. Which is why 1,600 firefighters like this man have died as a result only to exposure at the World Trade Center Ground Zero. In the first couple weeks, the firefighters were still able to go and look. Only the first couple weeks, remember, because then the New York Fire Department, or the police department, locked out the firefighters. There were fist fights, and then the FBI locked out the police department. But in the beginning, the firefighters were looking for their lost comrades. You know, they're a family, and these men were not protected at all. And they were inhaling the smoke, and 1,600 of them have died as a result of just exposure to that smoke. And Dr. Thomas Cahill from UC Davis said it was like they were working inside the stack of an incinerator. But when I asked him, in Davis, California, I asked him, Professor Cahill, I said, can you tell me what would account for such nanoparticles in the smoke? And he said, only temperatures hotter than the boiling point of the metal involved. So I wrote an article, Why Did Iron Boil Beneath the Rubble of the World Trade Center? I wrote it from Davis, California, where I went to school in the beginning. And then I got a call the next morning after I submitted my article to Washington. I got a call from my editor, and he said, your travel allowance has now been reduced to zero. Zero? I had $1,000 a month travel allowance. Now I had no travel allowance. I had to go home. I had to go back to Chicago where the FBI was all around my house. And I thought, this is very odd. But this is the payback I got. See, this was a discovery that was not supposed to happen. And my question about why did iron boil in the rubble of the World Trade Center was like, I was laying out very clearly the understanding that what was happening under the pile was this intensely thermetic reaction. And the evidence was clear. The evidence was also clear that the towers were exploded. This is the tower, one of the towers coming down. I think it's the South Tower. And, you know, for example, the South Tower, as it fell, in the very beginning, the top 30 stories tilted like this. And you would have expected it to fall over like a tree or down like that. It didn't. The top 30 stories fell, and then they demolished from the top down like that. And when I went to the church over here next door, there's an Episcopal church a couple years later, a year later, the priest was saying that he recalls hearing this boom, 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 and the falling floors. That's not the falling floors. The floors were falling at a rate of 10 per second. The buildings fell in 11 seconds, and one fell in about 10 seconds. That's faster than the speed of free fall. So the falls, they were going brrr, like that, were falling that fast. You didn't hear that. What he was hearing was major explosions happening every 10 floors that were thrusting the stuff out even further. Clearly the building is being demolished by explosives. Here is the People magazine from 1 week after 9/11, and there were some candid comments from people who were at the scene, like the firefighter Louis Caccioli. He said he was going up to the 24th floor to get people to bring evacuate workers down, and said on the last trip up, a bomb went off. We think there were bombs set in the building. But they talked to him, obviously, and he changed his tune. He stopped talking about bombs later. And this is what happened to everybody, really. This other woman, she talked about seeing bombs and explosions on the 74th floor. This is a very strange incident of 9/11. This is Building 6. Building 6 is this little 6-story building back here between Tower 7 and Tower 1. And you can see neither Tower 1 has not fallen yet. Tower 2 has not fallen yet. The street is still relatively clean. So this building is burning vigorously and has been exploded, but neither tower has fallen yet. What happened to Building 6? Here's Building 6 in the background after the collapse of the towers, 1 or 2. And you see the streets now all cluttered up. But that tower was very this building was very much destroyed prior to either tower falling. The New York Fire Department won't talk about this at all. I've tried. I paid my fees. I asked for the primary data about how they were spraying the building, water on this building, but they won't talk about it. They said 9/11 is all one. It's all one big thing. You know, we all know what happened. They've been talked to too. Here is the building 6 right here in the lower corner, and you can see that there's a big crater in the middle of it, and that crater goes down to the sub-basement level. That's very important. That means that in the bottom of this building was a big evidence vault. There was a vault that contained the criminal evidence for federal cases that were being investigated and prosecuted, like Enron and WorldCom and big gold scandals. Just big major crimes were being investigated by the federal government, which occupied Building 6 and Building 7. They kept all of their evidence in this vault because Building 7 had no vault. So the Building 6 was the place where the vault was. And obviously somebody cleaned out the vault the night before. We know that because Kurt Sonnenfeld went down there with his video camera and saw that the vault doors had been blown open, and he poked his camera back in there and he saw that the vault was cleaned out. So in order to cover that, to conceal that crime, they blew it up the next day, early in the morning. And this is a photograph of the super thermite that destroyed the World Trade Center. This is a micrograph. It's a close-up photograph. You see the red layer is the thermite layer, and there's a gray layer underneath of it, which is a lot of iron in it and some organic compounds. What it means is that when the red layer burns, when the thermetic layer burns, it creates this incredible heat, which then creates a gas from the gray layer. That becomes the explosion. That's what creates your explosion, the explosive power. And this is the paint. This is what this material looked like when it was photographed by Professor Jones. And when they heated this material up to 430 degrees temperature, it detonated and exploded with more energy than any known explosive. This is from the U.S. Department of Defense, energetics. They're talking here only about thermatic reactions. They're not talking about super thermite. They're talking about just thermatic reactions. And they're saying that metal oxidizer mixtures, thermites, have higher energy density than high explosives. Which means that these thermites, these top 4 things, have more energy than explosives. The bottom 4 things are explosives. And the third statement down there is that potential exists to increase kinetics by size reduction. That's what they're talking about, super thermite. When you reduce the size of the particles you're dealing with to nanoparticle size, you increase the power of the explosive incredibly, which gives you results like this. This is what was used to pulverize the 220 floors of the World Trade Center, which were 4 inches of concrete in 20-gauge steel pans. Now, if the towers had collapsed, like the government said, due to structural failure caused by burning fuel, you would have had a stack of 110 pancakes at the bottom of the pile. That's not there. Rather, you have no accumulation of pancakes at all. All the floors were turned into, basically, pulverized. Judy Wood calls this dustification, but she says this was a cold process that was done by some sort of Buck Rogers beam weapon that disassociated the molecules. Pure rubbish. This was done, this smoke was very hot. This smoke contained large amounts of, as I showed you, molten iron, which would scorch a car, which would burn people, that got affected by this. And here you see complete. So all you had left, as the man said, was dust and steel. This is the dust. This is the concrete floors, and this is everything that was on those floors. So first you had those 2,700 people in the building who were trapped in the building. First they were being cooked alive, then they were blown to smithereens. So nothing was found of them. Nothing. It's evil beyond imagination.
Yep.
Yeah. Here's Mr. Silverstein, who 6 weeks earlier, before the destruction, obtained the keys for the World Trade Center. Now this is important to understand because the World Trade Center was basically public property. It was built by the Rockefellers, true, but it was owned by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. It was public property that was privatized due to executive decisions and turned over to this man. His only claim to fame prior to this was that he was the owner of a strip club at LaGuardia called Runway 69, and he had been indicted in a drug suit with Bill Clinton that was dismissed, of course. But I mean, this guy suddenly becomes the owner of this property with $100 million of borrowed money from GMAC. Crazy. How did he get it? By hook and by crook. He got it. Larry Silverstein was a national chairman of a Zionist group called the UJA Federation of New York. He was a national chairman of that group. And the Port Authority, the director of the Port Authority who owned the World Trade Center was Lou Eisenberg, the man on the right. And Lou Eisenberg was also on the same board of directors with the UJA Federation as Larry Silverstein. So they have what I call the Zionist connection. They are board members of a very high-level Zionist fundraising group, and in their charity work, and then in the business work, Lou Eisenberg gave the lease to Larry Silverstein. He did this in a very strange way because there was a company called Varnado Realty who really should have gotten the contract for the World Trade Center, who was a real estate company who could have handled the job. But Eisenberg made the negotiations very difficult for Varnado. Varnado got up and walked away from the negotiation table, and it went right to Larry Silverstein. But how did all this happen? How did, here's Larry Silverstein with the mayor, Bloomberg, both looking very unhappy. His partner, Larry Silverstein's partner in this operation with the lease was this man, Israeli commando. His name is Frank Lowy, born in Czechoslovakia. He's now the owner of a company called Westfield, which owns shopping malls across the United States and Australia. This is the man that oversaw the whole privatization. He's Ronald Lauder. He's the son of Estee Lauder, and he was the director of Governor Pataki's privatization scheme, in which they decided which properties they would privatize. So Ronald Lauder said, let's privatize the World Trade Center. Then it went from when they decided, okay, we'll privatize the World Trade Center. And Lou Eisenberg then was in charge of the Port Authority. He was then the executive who then decided they would go to Larry Silverstein. So it went from one Zionist decision to another Zionist decision to the Zionist. And here we have Lauder was the director of the scheme. He funds the Lauder School of Government, Diplomacy and Strategy at Mossad University, IDC in Herzliya. The Mossad has like its own school called IDC. Here are the two Israeli leaders that are very much involved in 9/11. Of course, Bibi Netanyahu in the front. The man in the back is Ehud Olmert. And Ehud Olmert was actually in New York City on September 10th, 2001. But his visit was kept secret. This is very odd because he's the mayor of Jerusalem, which is a sister city of New York, and he was the deputy prime minister of the state of Israel. And he comes to New York City and is kept out of the news. I discovered it by reading the Jerusalem Post. But in this country, it was completely ignored. Why? Here he is 10 days later, he comes back after probably a lot of psychological manipulation and handling, and he comes back and he's like the big brother for Rudy Giuliani, and I'm the Israeli. We suffer this stuff all the time. We'll advise you what to do. But the weird thing is that it was completely, his visit to New York on September 10th and September 11th was completely left out of the papers. But on September 11th, in the afternoon, one Boeing 747 to El Al was allowed to leave under the United States Department of Defense. Under their orders, it was allowed to leave to Israel. So I assume that he was on that plane along with a lot of his other Israeli friends. So, from the devastation and catastrophe that's been visited upon this nation from 9/11, there is a bright spot. There is that little bright spot there. And that little bright spot is that by understanding the deception of 9/11, by exposing the people who are behind 9/11, and understanding who's behind the war on terror, we can undeceive ourselves and our neighbors and our friends, and more and more people will understand the deception. Because when the deception is exposed, when the deception is revealed, when you understand a magician's trick, he loses his power to fool you, right? So you have to undeceive yourselves, and that's the purpose of my work. One of my supporters says, look back through history, and you will see that big change comes from movements, not from politicians. So I know a lot of you probably think that you have hopes that maybe Mr. Trump or Mr. Sanders will solve 9/11 for us and the whole world will be better again. Don't expect anything from the politicians. Their hands are tied. It's up to us. We are the people of the nation that have to solve this. And it's a popular movement, and we have to do this because we have children and grandchildren, like this little boy in Montana. They deserve to have a country at peace. They deserve to have a country that has integrity. They deserve to have the truth. And we can't give them, a country that's deceived. So, and I want to tell you that this revolution, 9/11 truth, is revolutionary. You're on the vanguard. You people are on the vanguard, even 14 years later, because the rest of our people in this nation are either afraid to talk about this, they're afraid to embrace this truth, or they're completely lulled to sleep by the media. And they believe whatever CNN tells them, whatever Fox News tells them, and they say, we won't believe it until Fox News tells us the truth. But don't hold your breath, because Fox News and CNN will never tell you the truth of 9/11. They're part of the problem. And this is a revolution, but this is not a violent revolution. This is a revolution of awareness. This is a revolution of consciousness. And when enough people understand the deception, we will defang this beast and we will get ourselves out of this war. Because this war and all the wars we're fighting are completely fraudulent. With that, I want to thank you very much. And I want to thank Steve for putting on this event. Time we can have some questions and answers and some discussion. I want to tell you before that I do have some of you already got my book. I have the Solving 9/11 book, the small book. This is my analysis presented in a very concise format. This is 20. And I have the original articles. I have some of these. These are all the articles that I wrote from 2001 through 2012. Plus in the back of the book there's related articles pertaining to, for example, the undercover police attack on my house that I suffered and my eventual trip into exile. And then I also have my children's book. This is the ABC Zoo book, which is a very nice book for little kids. This is the first book I wrote, and it's got illustrated capitals and pictures of the animals and a little rhyme that I wrote. It's an ABC Zoo book. Very nice illustrations. So this is 20. I sell these books, like my ABC Zoo book and these books, to help fund my trip. And this is the end of my trip, really. The New York leg was added at the last minute after Denver. And I'm very glad that people like Steve have been so quick to pick up and make events like this happen. It's a real pleasure to be in Woodstock because, of course, Woodstock is an icon in American culture. But also I'll be going on to Boston and Hartford and Spring Valley. And so I'll be speaking for the duration of my visit. I'm leaving next Friday back to Sweden. So thank you very much. Question?
Can you just tell the crowd what happened to you at your house?
Okay, very briefly. After that discovery of the thermite, all that stuff in California, the newspaper reduced my travel allowance to 0. They knew that meant that I had to go home. I had been in the country already, back in the country for several months, living in safe houses in California and out west with Professor Jones and Ellen Mariani and people out in California. And they knew that when they cut my allowance to nothing, I would have to go home. And at home,
in Chicago.
Outside Chicago. At home, I had been surveilled for years by the FBI. There were people that had befriended me, who weren't really my friends, who then openly told us that they were informing the FBI. One woman said, yeah, the FBI, 2 FBI agents came to my house the other night and they were asking questions about you, and we talked for 2 hours. And, okay, that's cool. And then this other guy who was a Lebanese fella who worked at the post office, he came to my house one day and he said, yeah, now I got another job too. I got a second job. I work for the FBI. So they were like openly telling me this, wanting me to scare me or something. But I didn't want to live in my home in Chicago, outside Chicago, with like no perimeter fence or anything, with FBI people snooping around all the time. And but after this, they cut my allowance to 0. I had to go back. My kids wanted to go home. They wanted to see the house again. They wanted to see their bicycles. So we went home, and I noticed right away that the police were surveilling me, the local police. And they were around my house all the time, which is very odd. But I knew something was up. And then they started driving around my house with a car, an unmarked car, with 3 men